Automotive CEOs are absolutely panicking. What's to blame are cheap Chinese-built EVs, domestic EV mandates, stagnating vehicle sales, and wasteful engineering and product development practices. This and more was all laid out in a white paper published from the SAE's Global Leadership Conference. But the thing is, the people that are putting out this paper are the elites of the automotive industry and might not necessarily have the best interest of the consumer at heart. So today we are going to dissect this white paper and examine if their concerns are legitimate or just bluster. So for a little bit of background before we dive into this, SAE, for those that may not be aware, stands for the Society of Automotive Engineers, and it is a professional trade group with very, very deep roots in the automotive industry. And each year they host a Global Leadership Conference, or GLC, where they get together a bunch of the top industry executives where they talk about some of the common challenges facing the OEMs. And when I say industry executives, I'm talking about some very heavy hitters from brands like Ford, Toyota, General Motors, Volkswagen, and Kia. But really, the focus of this conference is on implications for the US market, because that is where a lot of these different brands sell the majority of their cars. And as a byproduct of this conference, we received a white paper titled "The Automotive Industry at Risk." And this document does a pretty good job of being comprehensive, covering all of the different problems facing the industry while still keeping things relatively brief. It's about 7 pages long, and I will link a copy of it in the description of this video. So the paper basically starts off by talking about how important the automotive industry is to the United States economy. It talks about how it is a crucial part of the US industrial base, how it employs about 1 million people and contributes around 5% to our GDP, and then also talks about some national security implications that are supported by the automotive industry. And then it pretty clearly states that to be successful in the future, legacy automakers are going to have to make a lot of changes. But before we talk about those changes, let's first touch on some of the issues. The first main problem area that is identified here are mandates for full EVs or plug-in hybrid vehicles. Now, for simplicity's sake, we are just going to refer to these as EV mandates. And specifically, the one state that is called out in this paper is California. They have a mandate that by the model year 2026, 35% of new vehicles that are being sold in the state are going to have to be EVs. The problem, though, is that California is currently only at 27%, and it is unlikely to take a 8-point jump in the next couple of months before this mandate starts. But a broader issue is that there are a bunch of states that follow the California Air and Resource Board, and they are even farther behind. Specifically calling out New York at only about 12% and Rhode Island at only 9%. And these regulations are only slated to get more restrictive over time, jumping up to 43% in the 2027 model year, and then up to 51% for the 2028 model year. And as the law currently stands, if an automaker is not compliant, they face massive penalties. Many of these laws, many of these mandates were written 3, 4, 5 years ago when we were just kind of guessing what EV adoption rates were going to be, and clearly we have fallen significantly short of that. And the reasons for this slow EV adoption, I think we can really pin on both sides. Manufacturers were just slow to adopt this technology and put out compelling products that people actually wanted to buy. And at the same time, consumers have not been as receptive to EVs as we had initially expected. And there just really is such a wide range of things working against EVs. From price to the actual product itself, to the charging infrastructure, to politics, to the temperature where you live. So to circle back around to the mandates, I do think this is a legitimate area of concern, and I assume most of these state governments are going to roll back these regulations as we approach the midsummer deadline. Now, another area of concern is the idea that our cars are becoming software-defined vehicles. And this is totally independent to the rise of EVs. Today's cars, more broadly, just have a lot of tech built into them. And with that, the trend as of late has been for all of these different systems to have a centralized control unit, one onboard computer that runs everything, which is far more efficient, but extremely difficult to implement. And what this ends up resulting in is just adding an additional layer of difficulty in developing and producing cars. And my thought here, I do have some sympathy for the automakers. For decades, what they had to focus on was engineering and producing mechanical components. So that is what they got really good at. And then this technological revolution happens, and they still have to keep producing cars, but at the same time pivot into basically being a tech company. And while I recognize that is very difficult to do, it has been abundantly clear that this is the direction that the automotive industry has been heading in for a while now. And if you want to build cars in 2025, 2026, this is what it's going to take. But leading into another one of their concerns, when you have an industry that undergoes such a massive change, it opens the door up for newcomers to come in and disrupt things. In the US, we typically think of this newcomer as being Tesla, but on a global scale, it is the Chinese-built EV companies. It is hard to understate just how rapidly Chinese EVs have gained popularity and market share over the past few years. And this is due to a few different reasons. The first is that building EVs has been a strategic priority of the Chinese government, and because they wield a massive amount of power over companies, it is actually getting done. They also already had an incredibly strong manufacturing base, and because of their investments in rare earth minerals, they now own the EV supply chain end to end. What this ends up meaning is that Chinese-built EVs have around a 35% cost advantage compared to the legacy automakers. And this has resulted in explosive growth in the Chinese domestic market and also other places now as these cars are starting to get exported to other places in Asia and Latin America. What this ends up meaning for the US-based automakers is around a 6.5% decrease in global market share. But the one thing keeping this from cascading and really getting out of control are tariffs. The US has something like 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, basically making them impossible to get into the country, and now Europe is starting to follow suit. Now, this is something that I have a little bit more of a mixed opinion on. If the Chinese are able to build an EV that is of a high enough quality and comes in at a low enough cost that people prefer it over American-built EVs or even American-built ICE cars, they should be allowed to buy it. But at the same time, if that was allowed to be, it would do tremendous harm to the American auto industry and American workers. And approaching this from a historical perspective, the US has been very protectionist with the automotive industry in the past, and it kind of makes sense why they're also doing that here. But tariffs just aren't going to be a tenable long-term solution here. And the automakers do seem to recognize that in the white paper. If they are executed correctly, the automakers state that the tariffs will simply provide them with enough time to catch up. To circle back around to something I mentioned before about market share, another concern laid out here is the idea that we have approached peak auto. Due to a variety of factors, the total number of new cars that are being sold every year in the US is actually less than it was a decade ago. And it is a similar story in Europe, Japan, and South Korea. This just means that in their home markets, there is even less of an opportunity to sell cars, which makes the type of growth that is demanded to be deemed a successful company even more difficult. Now, this paper is simply not an airing of grievances. It does have some specific action items for automakers to help them be more successful. Taking a page out of the Chinese EV company's playbook, they identify that the automotive industry needs to have more control over its supply chain. More control over sourcing parts and materials can help them build cars quicker and at a lower cost. They also identify an opportunity to unlearn old engineering practices. Because when you build gas cars for over a century, there are just going to be things that get ingrained that you just take as fact, but might not necessarily be necessary when you're trying to build an EV. And this is one of the big advantages that EV startups have because they're approaching the car with a clean build sheet. And specific to the Chinese EV automakers, this paper outlines a few of their product development practices that could be implemented to help reduce costs. For one, they empower their suppliers by giving them goals for components instead of instructions. This allows the suppliers to act a lot faster because they're able to figure things out on their own instead of basically just going through a procedure. The Chinese companies are also much quicker to launch new products that may still need some fine-tuning, but can be fixed with an over-the-air update, opposed to legacy auto manufacturers that really only want to put out a product when they are 100% sure it is complete. Now, one of the last sections talks about some of the political power that is needed by the industry to accomplish its goals, mainly stating that the industry punches well below its weight in terms of lobbying, and that a more concerted effort could really benefit them. And we get a nice little summary at the end that ties this out and again stresses the importance of protecting this industry. Basically, they are asking for more streamlined regulations and a more realistic timetable in terms of EV mandates. So, my overarching thoughts on this white paper: I think it sounds pretty reasonable. I am in agreement that the US auto industry is an important industry to protect, both because it does employ a lot of people and also because it contributes to the US's manufacturing base. In terms of EV mandates, considering where we are at right now, the mandates that are currently on the books are simply too ambitious. And I do have sympathy for the automakers, considering how much has changed with cars in the past decade. On the regulation front, there likely is some opportunity to streamline, but to be abundantly clear, streamline does not mean decrease any of our standards. The automakers should be held to extremely high, if not higher standards, but with a more straightforward regulatory process. What I think is missing from this white paper, and maybe this wasn't the intent of the paper, but I would have really liked to see some ownership for the situation that they have gotten themselves into. Automakers are extremely slow to adopt new technology and are also extremely risk adverse. This is what opened the door for startups like Tesla to eat into their market share. And with something like vehicle computer systems, the legacy OEMs have just dragged their feet for so long, and now they're complaining that they got left behind. And it's a similar story with some of these learnings they're laying out in terms of engineering and product development. These are things that should have been picked up and implemented in real time, not something that you are lamenting about in a white paper years later. And on the lobbying front, I personally think lobbying is one of the worst parts of our political system. But acknowledging the position that we are in, it probably is a good idea for the automotive industry to do it. All in all, the industry is in trouble, and I think step one in fixing it is acknowledging the problem. We do need automakers to follow through on the action plan that was laid out in this white paper, and we also need the corresponding government action to have a strong and prosperous automotive industry.